everyone, Kat here with a little something to say about Gen-Oners. In Pokemon community speak, they're the players who play through Kanto and usually Johto, only to give up and refuse to play the other games. If you ask, they'll say Kanto was the best region or possibly the only region as far as they're concerned. And of course, players who enjoy the more modern games get frustrated by this. I wouldn't call myself a Gen-Oner, but I am old enough to remember the rough transition from Gen 2 to Gen 3, so I thought I'd put that in a little more context. Keep in mind that I'm a US player, and while the internet certainly existed then, it was not in heavy everyday use. So, the year is 1998 and Pokemon is all the rage. Everyone's at least heard of it and millions of players love it. But a lot of us are wondering if this is it. If 151 Pokemon is all there will ever be. Pokemon Yellow gave us some fun new mechanics, but it didn't change the roster in any way. Then it happened. We got news that Pokemon Gold and Silver were coming. A real sequel to the game we all loved, with 100 brand new species and Pokemon breeding. Now, you and your friend can trade starter eggs instead of begging each other not to evolve until you've got the Dex credit for that next evolution stage. Yes, there were also shinies, but these actually weren't advertised or mentioned. I guess it was supposed to be a surprise, but if you found one before you hit the red Gyarados, it probably would look more like your game was freaking out than you found something special. Ask me how I know. But here was the most interesting thing about the Gen 2 games. Once you completed the 8 gyms, you couldn't face the Elite Four unless you traveled back to Kanto. All of Kanto was contained in this game. You could battle the original 8 gym leaders. Throughout the plot of the game, you took down a more complex Team Rocket with an actual story beyond "we're evil, beat us up." Gold Silver was both a new game and an improved version of the original wrapped into one. You could get a whopping 16 badges in this thing, a number that hasn't been repeated since. About that new day and night cycle though. No, it wasn't too confusing for die-hard Gen 1 fans, but it was kind of a pain. Once you set the time, you couldn't change it to anything else. It was built into the game. It's also the reason why the batteries in Gen 2 cartridges will die so much more quickly than in Gen 1. I learned much later that apparently there is a way to reset the time, but remember, this was before widespread internet usage. Just Google it wasn't a thing. So I was stuck with the gold-silver time that I had. My sleep cycle has always been go to bed really early and get up equally early, so I only had a small post-dinner window to do all the catching and evolving that was exclusive to nighttime. And yeah, that part did make me miss some elements of red and blue. But in Gen 2's favor, I could finally play as a girl. Well, kinda. If I bought Pokemon Crystal later on. And even then, my character had to dress as a boy if I wanted to interact with my Gen 1 game, so half a win? Let's talk about that trading back and forth from the Gen 1 games for a sec though, because this is one aspect Gen 2 almost did too well, to the extent that I'd argue it's the biggest thing that sunk Gen 3 for many so-called Gen-Oners. Gold, Silver, and Crystal gave its players forward and backwards compatibility with trading between gens, something no other Pokemon games have been able to do. When Ruby and Sapphire were announced, at the turn of the millennium, we expected they would do something similar. Why wouldn't they give us everything Gen 2 did and more? We thought we'd be able to catch a Pikachu in Gen 3 and trade it back to our original Red and Blue games via Gold and Silver. Then came the news that Ruby and Sapphire were only for the Game Boy Advance. Okay, that didn't look good, but surely there'd be a way to at least trade up your Gen 2 mons, even if you couldn't send them back. After all, Game Boy cartridges could still be played in a GBA. Nope, that wasn't happening either. Ruby and Sapphire were a complete reset as far as your team went. And if this had been a precedent set in Silver and Gold, I think we all would have been fine with that. But the backwards compatibility and the return to Kanto as part of the gameplay really made it feel like Kanto was indeed our real home in the world of Pokemon. This wasn't something that Gen 1ers pulled out of nowhere. The Gen 2 games sold them on the concept. Then the Gen 3 games basically said, just kidding. Even in the anime, classic characters are abandoned for new ones. Characters who do stay leave behind their Pokemon to make a fresh team. A lot of people weren't ready for that. The loss felt real. Your very first starter Pokemon, your first shiny, the Entei it took you hours to chase down. Or that event-exclusive Mew that you got from showing up in person to a Pokémon event in 1999? Now, they're stuck forever on an old cartridge, whose battery will eventually die, and take your Pokémon with it. I remember the day I turned on my game to realize it had happened to me. It really sucked. I still have the certificate from that Mew, by the way. It's fascinating that Pokémon has never blocked off one generation from the next since then. As long as Pokémon Bank keeps running, you can bring a Pokémon you caught on a game over 20 years ago and play it on a modern game. It's both amazing and insane, but that's how bad the backlash was. Even when Pokémon Bank does go down someday, there at least was a link at some point. From Gen 3 on, old fans can bring their very first Pokémon friends into a modern game. Now, I know there are 10 species that can come into home, but can't go out to any other game yet. However, we can anticipate that they will eventually have a space to go to as new games are made. A lot of us who were there for Gen 1's release didn't own a Game Boy before Pokémon. When Gen 3 came out, we had a choice to make. We'd already bought one new system for this franchise. Did we love it enough to do it again? If your interest in Pokémon was waning, having to buy a whole new system and start from scratch felt like the tipping point. Sure, you liked it, but you didn't like it enough to take that next step. Saying no wasn't weird, just a natural consequence of a franchise moving forward in a radically different way. You lose some players. And in selling fans on the idea that their digital companions will always be with them, Pokémon lost a lot more. It created this domino effect. In a game that built itself on trading and community, if the person you've always played with drops out, you're probably doing the same. Now, of course, Pokémon didn't end there. Gen 3 had enough returning players and new players who didn't have that sentimental attachment to Gens 1 and 2. And I'm thrilled about that. At the same time, though, I can't fault players who dropped out and moved on to other things. And I'm hesitant to call them Gen-Oners unless they really put others down. See, people aren't hating on later generations when they say they only played the first two. They just like what they're familiar with. And that's okay. I hope this was helpful in bringing a fresh take on a little early period of Pokémon history. If you guys would like to hear my take on anything else from the early days of the franchise, whether it's the anime or TCG or just the community in general, let me know in the comments. Oh, and just to prove I do know about the modern games too, here, have a video essay about Scarlet and Violet's gym plotline. Don't forget to subscribe, and until next time, happy reading and happy training!